Welcome to the ride. The plan today is to ride from Coonambula, which is near where we are at the moment, to Maryborough in Queensland, Australia, following roads that existed in 1884 and 1885. Now, why on earth have I chosen these roads? Actually, it's a family history thing. I'm trying to follow the travels of my great-grandparents, Thomas and Jane, and their sons, Thomas and Harold. I'm Phil, and that's definitely enough talking. Let's get going. The countryside around me now is where Thomas worked when he was employed at the cattle station called Coonambula. Riding here, it's clear that it contrasts quite starkly with the densely populated cities of West Bromwich, where the family used to live, and Birmingham, where Thomas worked. So how did Thomas manage to get to Coonambula? As we cycle through his workplace, let's use our imagination based on what we do know. We know he landed in Maryborough. We can imagine him walking across the wharf-side railway line, as he would have done, and up the path leading to the customs house, presumably the path of his first steps in Australia. He was then 24 years old, and the first of the family to arrive. His ship, the Earl Derby, anchored off the White Cliffs, which are near the current-day Hervey Bay. That was the afternoon of 22nd of January 1884. An article from the local newspaper, written by one of his fellow passengers, described their trip up the Mary River and their arrival in Maryborough. Now, if I can read from that article, with something like 350 souls on board the little steamer and the thermometer wavering between 100 and 102 degrees, the trip up the river gave the passengers some idea of a Queenslander summer day. Great interest was taken by the new arrivals in objects of interest on the banks: farms, sawmills, plantations, and other industries. The first sight of Maryborough was enough to bring forth hearty peals of cheers, which were lustily responded to by a number of persons on the wharves and in the gardens and on the waterfront. Let's take a break, shall we? From our imaginings of Thomas walking up to the customs house on the way to the immigration depot. The steamer mentioned in the newspaper article was the Silver. It had taken the passengers from the Earl Derby on the afternoon of the day after their arrival for the trip up the Mary River to Maryborough. The Earl Derby was a sailing ship and, as it turned out, had to wait several weeks until a suitable steamer could tow it up the Mary River to the Maryborough waterfront. The name of the newspaper is a bit of a mouthful. It's the Maryborough Chronicle, Wide Bay and Burnett Advertiser. It would have taken some time just to typeset the title. Did you happen to notice the prominent building that would have dominated the skyline of Maryborough as the steamer approached? It's the one on the right-hand side of the painting. That's the law courts and government offices, and it was completed about 5 years before Thomas arrived. I suspect he couldn't have not noticed it. It still looks pretty impressive today. Anyway, Thomas remained in the immigration depot until the 1st of February. It hadn't been hot, with an occasional thunderstorm apparently, and probably uncomfortable. Newspaper reports had also described the deaths through heat stroke of several men and horses. Other newspaper reports had grumbled about the fact that some of the newcomers had not been taken by employers. It's not surprising given there'd been a drought for a year. Thomas and one other, the 29-year-old Walter Jennings, were employed by William Forster McCord, manager at Coonambula and Mundubbera cattle stations. At the moment I'm still on Coonambula cattle station, on the Coonambula to Mundubbera road. So I dare say Thomas would have ridden his horse along this road more than a few times. It's probably an easier road to cycle today than what it would have been when Thomas and later the family travelled along it. Still, it's pretty cool to know that I'm following their footsteps. Arriving at Coonambula, Thomas and Walter would have noticed a well-established property. Possibly a welcome sight after the rugged 200-plus kilometre journey to get there. Presumably they would have been directed to the men's quarters. The homestead was in ruins, having been destroyed by fire in the previous November. Advertisements for a rubble mason had been placed in newspapers, and I presume one had been found at some stage. Perhaps it's possible that one of Thomas's tasks would have been to provide labour to help rebuild the homestead. Exactly what Thomas would have done while working at Coonambula is unknown at the moment, but according to newspaper reports, several mobs of cattle and horses were driven to the property during the year. Quite a few newspaper reports described a botched election, a consequence of which was that Thomas had to enrol to vote before they could rehold the election. The town of Mundubbera hadn't been built when Thomas arrived. It's a bit of a shame because the accommodation and options for food may have been limited. The reason? Mrs. Corey's Prince of Wales Hotel, built on William McCord's Mundubbera property, had suffered a disastrous fire in the previous November. Nevertheless, we might assume the property was a stopping place on the journey between Maryborough and Coonambula. One of the stops along the way from Maryborough to Coonambula would have been Gayndah. A newspaper description of the main street, published in April 1883, mentions that the main street forms an excellent feeding ground for the domestic cow. I had been told before arrival at the town that the streets were macadamised, but if this was so, the metal used must be of a very fertile nature, for a more healthy crop of grass than was to be seen on the street could hardly be found. Good luck with trying to graze the domestic cow on today's main street. The article also describes the condition of the road to Gayndah as rough, indeed disgraceful. Weather-wise, it seemed that most of the year was dry and grass coverage was becoming progressively thinner. According to advertisements for tenders for mail services, Coonambula was to receive a once-a-week postal service, so I presume Thomas and the family were able to keep in contact. That once-a-week postal service would have been dependent on the road conditions. Even on a relatively gentle section between Biggendon and the site of Golden Fleece, there are creek crossings, as you can see. Mailmen apparently lost horses, wagons, and sometimes their lives trying to negotiate creek crossing to deliver the mail. travelling the road by coach would not have been a wonderfully comfortable experience. In the meantime, in April 1884, Jane and the boys welcomed a daughter and sister to the family living in Birmingham. Annie, Rebecca, Dorothy. It must have been a busy year for Jane, looking after the children and preparing for their voyage to Australia. On 11th of November, they disembarked from the ship called the Duke of Argyll at Brisbane. Presumably they stayed initially at the immigration depot in William Street. The weather report for that day was simply a northeast wind, overcast. Apparently Brisbane had also experienced dry conditions over the year. Now, the details of the reunion of Thomas and the family are not yet known. One thing that is known is that Thomas did not get a chance to meet his daughter, because she died during the voyage and had been buried at sea. Did Thomas travel to Brisbane to meet the family? How did they get from Brisbane to Coonambula? Sorry, I don't yet have an answer to those questions. The family were definitely together, presumably at Coonambula, in February 1885, as that was when their next child was conceived. Due to the lack of detail about their life at that time, all I can say is that the next chapter of their life begins in May 1885 in Sydney, and that is another story.